You're listening to Investigation Insiders by Integris Intelligence.
Hello again, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Investigation Insiders. This is Forhad. Hope you are all well and safe. As usual, we have another fantastic guest today, Margaret Donohoe of the Donohoe Talbert Law Firm. How are you today? Thanks so much for joining me.
Good morning, Forhad. So happy to be here today. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's been a long time in the making, but I'm glad we got it off the ground. So, I just for context, Margaret and I met many years ago at this point when we were able to work together on a matter related to one of her clients. It's kind of interesting because or the person was very interesting, and the case was very interesting. I'll leave it at that, and I'm sure you remember what I'm talking about, Margaret. But fortunately, since then, we've had a chance to work on other cases, and I've always found working with your team that it was always pretty like straightforward. And what I mean by that is I think we all share a client-centric focus, but with real-world experience and views, and sort of with common sense as well, which usually leads to better results for our clients. So hopefully that's a fair summary, Margaret.
I think so. And I've enjoyed working with your firm as well because we're always trying to center the best interest of the client, take some of the emotion out of it, and think about what we can really achieve to promote the client's goals while supporting them. Because at bottom, there's people and their lives involved.
Yeah, I think the emotional part of dealing with people versus corporations is always always an interesting thing, and I'm sure we'll get into that as we go through the episode here. But perhaps you can start by providing a high level sort of overview of your career.
Sure. So I went to Yale Law School. Coming out of law school, I worked for a federal judge in a clerkship, which is a pretty typical path, and went to a large firm to do commercial litigation. I did that for several years. I worked with really wonderful, highly ethical, brilliant people. And after 3 years, it was very clear to me that that was not for me, not because of uh, not liking the people, but I think I was attracted to being a lawyer by wanting to represent individual human beings with issues in their lives. And that's what I find compelling and is interesting to me. So I wanted something that was a little bit more personal. And I wanted to get into a field where I could have my own business because that's also something I love. So I'm very fortunate. The practice has been incredibly good to me. I have a boutique law firm with my other founding partner, Paul Talbert. We now have 8 lawyers here. We're exclusively in family law. We're doing prenups, divorces, custody, anything related to that. And I have found the practice really fulfilling. It's a very special role to be in to help someone through that particular chapter of their life, which is so um, disconnecting in the sense of it affects everything. It affects your work, your children, your home, your money, your future. Um, and I really value it. I have great relationships with clients. I have great relationships with former clients, and I just really proud of what we've built here at Donohoe Talbert.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I get a front row seat at times to watch you guys perform, and I can attest to the fact that you guys do take that care in servicing your clients. So I guess I have some other questions for you, more on the personal side. So where did you grow up, and how did you end up like wanting to be or becoming an attorney?
So I grew up near Philadelphia.
Okay.
My parents had myself and my sister quite young. And then when I was in high school, my mother went back to law school
Hmm.
and became a lawyer. And that was very inspiring to me and very interesting to me. Um, and, the things a lawyer does fell well within my skill set. So I came out of college and went straight into law school. And as I said, I went into commercial work. But my mother was in family law. So when it was time for me to think about, taking a turn in my own path, I knew about family law. She practiced in a very different setting than what I went into. Her passion was to represent um, people who really had no voice. She represented abused and neglected children in Washington, D.C. for years. I sometimes would go and watch her in court. Um, and it was just very real in a way that appealed to me. And I was impressed by her and the other lawyers who worked there and how they gave voice to um, people who sometimes were caught up in a legal system that wasn't serving them well or that they couldn't understand easily. And so I decided when I was making my own trajectory change in practice that I was going to look into family law. Now we do high net worth cases. It's actually quite different than what my mother did, but I think because of her example, it was something that I became interested in and looked at.
Interestingly, I would argue, and I went through this with a family member of mine. Fortunately, I have not gone through it, but regardless of your net worth, the feelings associated with going through like some of the issues that you deal with are pretty common. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Everyone encounters grief, loss, anger, sadness, fear. It's a really scary phase in life, even when things go as well as they could possibly go, because change is scary.
Yeah, yeah,
And then
yeah.
sometimes there's betrayal, um, loss of trust. Sometimes there are cases with abuse involved.
Sure.
So we're definitely dealing with people at a very difficult juncture.
Sure. Again, we talked a little bit about why you chose family law, but what sticks out in your mind so far in your career about perhaps highlights as an attorney?
Well, I'll tell you my favorite thing right now is that when I meet a potential new client for the first time, usually that person is feeling really uncertain, scared, sad, but I know that they have a wonderful chapter ahead of them before long.
Hmm.
So I focus a lot on helping people think forward.
Hmm.
Um, even if you can't stay in the home that you love, well, let's think about what you could do and the things about it that you might like. Maybe someone's sad because they're not going to live with their children all the time. That's a really, really hard thing.
Sure.
But really focus on, okay, how can you create the best situation for your children? Because everybody wants their children to be happy, healthy, and well, right? Which means having two parents if that's possible for the child. Um, so I really, I love seeing people get through the process and emerge into the next chapter of their life. And I'm very lucky that, a lot of clients choose to share that with me, to, send me a card saying, my daughter, who was the subject of our custody dispute, just left for college and she's doing great. Um, so for me, those are the highlights.
Sure. I mean that's fantastic, and truthfully, I don't know if I've ever heard it described that way before. So that's fantastic for you and fantastic for your clients. So our audience, our show is called Investigation Insiders. So really, when we started it, it was to peel back the layers on different things that we're involved with and give our audience sort of like a behind the scenes look at things, right? So perhaps, and they love stories. We know that for sure. So is there a story or two that you can share, which demonstrates your commitment to helping people deal with complex family matters?
So, sure. One story that comes to mind involves a client, a woman whose husband had a fairly complex business with a group of partners who were also his close friends. There was a lot of concern about, what are these guys getting up to? Do we really know what's going on in the business? And then right at the time of the divorce, they decided to sell the business. Um, it was a real business and quite a profitable one. And the business deal was very, very complex. So in that case, the client and I decided to hire a corporate co-counsel to review all the business documents and help make sure that we were not losing any threads, because the way the comp was coming in on this buyout, there were like 10 different elements to it. It had different timing, different rules, different parameters. All the while, the case had some complex custody-related issues going on. So the client and I did a lot of strategizing with each other to help her keep the lines of communication open with her husband, soon to be husband, so that they could collaborate and support the kids while still being as aggressive as we needed to be on the financial part. And we were able together to be a great team and be really thoughtful and strategic in getting her a fantastic outcome in terms of sharing in the business buyout that he was doing, and also having, without exacerbating the child situation into any kind of a fight. So that was a tightrope.
Just out of curiosity, the sale of the business, was that just coincidental, or was it related to the divorce and somehow potentially giving, I guess, her husband some sort of advantage related to the finances?
I do not believe it was to disadvantage her. It wasn't sort of what we would call divorce planning. It
Right.
wasn't, whether on some psychological level, winding up the business and winding up the marriage were related to each other in some way. I'd guess that they were.
Yep. 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 Well, that's interesting because it sort of leads into kind of the topic of the show, right? Um, Obviously, as we've discussed and I've mentioned before on our show, we typically, Integris does not typically get involved in divorce or family related work or investigations. However, literally everybody listening to this show, unfortunately or fortunately, maybe, it can be in need of these things. So part of the reason why I wanted to have you on here, Margaret, was to kind of talk about this topic, which has to do with basically um, married business owner breakups, right? So you're married, and there's a business either you own together or own separately, and kind of the complexities around that. So could you talk a little bit about the different structures that exist for business ownership as it relates to a married couple, and how and why does this matter?
Sure thing. So New York matrimonial law is going to consider a business to be really broadly defined. So you could have, the kind of businesses we're used to thinking about. It's a partnership or it's a corporation, it's an LLC or an LLP, and sometimes married couples will form a business in any of those structures. You can also have a business that under the matrimonial law is quote unquote marital property, even though the title is held only in the name of one of the spouses.
Hmm.
And that's the general structure of the matrimonial law. The matrimonial law wants to capture as much property as possible into the pool that will be divided between the two spouses. This can reach even, I'm trying to think of examples that always blow people's minds. Say a partner in a very international law firm with hundreds and hundreds of partners. That partnership will be considered a business. It will be valued, it will be distributed, even though it's not sellable, it's not transferable, It can be taken away from the holder by the partnership. Usually, the partnership agreement provides at any time. I should be clear, courts do not take that kind of a business or any kind of a business and give the other spouse an interest in the business. What I'm talking about is money.
Mm-hmm.
That there'll be valuation, payment of cash money. Courts are in the business of dividing. So say the couple owns together an eBay business.
Mm-hmm.
The court is not going to leave them in business together.
Okay.
The couple could agree to stay in business together, but a court can't do that. The law won't do it because the law divides. The law wants two people who are economically separate to go their separate ways. Further, I'll give you a little bit of history on this for what it's worth, because it is interesting.
Sure.
New York was very concerned with the unfairness of a marriage where, both people kind of poured all of their work and all the decisions were made to elevate the earning ability of one spouse.
Sure.
So a classic case in New York was an opera singer, and her husband de facto worked as her manager. And she was an international star, very high earning ability, very high earning history. And he didn't really have a skill set other than helping her, right? That was his life, was promoting her, helping her, traveling with her. And in the divorce, the court created this idea of enhanced earning capacity, which was really treated like a business. And so when I came into the field, which is more years ago than I would care to tell you right now, this was a rubric in New York matrimonial law that even a high earner, it could sort of be considered to be a business, and we would have valuation professionals create a valuation. There'd be some kind of lump sum money payout to the other spouse. Well, the legislature eventually decided that that had gone a little overboard. And in 2015, there were some statutory amendments that took away this idea of just enhanced earning capacity as an asset and revised the spousal maintenance law, known as alimony, to my friends at the IRS, so that hopefully the unfairness of one person having a much greater earning ability developed during the marriage, the other person perhaps having not pursued educational opportunities and professional opportunities and not leaving with a high earning capacity, to use the spousal support to try to address that, rather than this idea of we're creating an asset. But all that being said, the idea of what is a business in New York under the matrimonial law is very broadly construed. The actual type of business structure, it doesn't matter so much. It may impact the valuation, but the court's going to do essentially the same thing either way, which is look at a value and what percentage of the value should be paid as a cash award to the other spouse.
Sure. Oh, that's really helpful, actually, because I bet you a lot of people don't realize that, which actually leads into my next question. So, if there are any, what are some of the factors that should be considered when getting married or setting up a business after getting married?
Well, we do a lot of prenup work, so I'm used to discussing this in that capacity. But the reality is most people are not going to plan. Most people make decisions based on what makes sense for their family at the time. And the last thing they're thinking about is, well, what if this doesn't work out? But I'm going to actually answer the question you asked me. Anytime the business has the kinds of structures and paperwork and clarity of responsibility that an arm's length business would normally have, that's going to be easier to manage if things start not working out in the relationship. So, what is the ownership structure? Has a deliberate decision been made as to whether both spouses are going to own direct interests in the business?
Right.
What is the structure for making decisions for the business? I mean, when you see couples in business together and there's deterioration, often it's around that issue. Who makes the decisions? Do we both need to sign off? Do we have areas of responsibility that are separate? How will the business be financed? Are we doing commercial financing? Are we borrowing from my parents? Are we borrowing from your parents? If we're doing that, do we create appropriate documentation as to the nature of, is it a loan? Is it an investment? Part of the issue around family businesses is it's so common to see that those formalities, nobody worries about them, right? You worry about them later when you're fighting over whether your parents loaned you the money or invested the money. So I think the best advice would be to make it a real business, right? If you're going to start a business, take that moment to communicate, make decisions about what you're doing together or not together, make decisions about whose name is on what, spheres of responsibility. And I mean, could probably go for anything in a relationship. The communication piece is going to be the key piece. So I can't tell you how often I meet a new client who says, I thought my name was on the business. I thought my name was on the house. And I only found out years later that it wasn't. And while it's completely normal in a marriage to have a division of labor, having basic information just seems healthy for the relationship.
Sure. You know what? I got to tell you, I think that single point is probably one of the most important points that we'll talk about. In fact, on a personal note, some family members are going through that exact same issue. In fact, this is not between husband wife, but siblings, and one of them passed away, and they're sort of finding out things now that they didn't talk about or think about or document properly in the past, and that's making things very uncomfortable because, I mean, things happen over the years where certain people do more on one end, others do more on another end, and that's not tangible, right? Like a document is. So that's a really, really interesting point. And so, and in a way, well, can you talk a little bit about how helpful proper documentation is later? Let's just say you do run into a problem and there is documentation delineating all those different things. How much easier is it if you run into a problem later on?
I would say like a billion times easier.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So that's
For
important.
us, anytime, we always want documents because documents are definitive when you're trying to sort out people's finances. They might not be definitive in terms of, okay, what percentage of this asset is the other spouse going to receive an award for? But we can spend a lot of time, we can spend a lot of money, and a fair amount of, emotional goodwill between the parties can be used up when people are arguing about what the facts are.
Mm-hmm.
And, you also get into an area where things aren't documented. People in good faith can really, truly have different beliefs and understandings about what their arrangement was.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a super, and I believe that's what's going on with my relatives, actually. I think both parties are saying what's true in their head, but it's opposite what the other thinks. And so I think that's a very critical point. How about, do you have any advice for anyone that's in a situation like this, contemplating getting into a business or into a marriage or whatever the case is? I think a prenup would help pre-marriage, I guess, but post-marriage, like, how do you even approach a discussion like this? Like, do you have any recommendations for how to even approach the discussion?
So my advice would always be that you might as well be transparent because things are going to be transparent in the end.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think if you're thinking about there's a business and I'm worried about what's happening in the relationship. I don't know if we're going to make it. Open your books.
Right.
Because you know what? The law is going to require you to open your books anyway. If you've been accumulating cash in the business because you were contemplating maybe buying a building or something,
Sure.
that's really probably excess cash that your spouse should share.
Hmm.
I think have regard for the fact that, at least if you have professionals involved, something like that will be really obvious on day one. And you might as well just be straightforward about it, because the chances are you're going to drive a better deal by not. I'll tell you what, my dad used to say, pigs get fat, hogs get slaughtered. And I sort of believe that.
Sure. Sure. No, I think that's fair. Yep.
So, you know, I think respecting what the situation is, being transparent with information. If, I'm going to tell the greatest secret of all time to making your divorce less expensive. You're going to hear it right here. When your lawyer asks you for some documents, organize and hand them over efficiently and completely. Because the
Sure.
last thing you want to pay us to do is realize that 3 of the documents are missing. They're all out of order. Somebody's shuffling this pile of stuff. Pages are missing from the October statement. It's
Yep.
a huge, it's time consuming and really wasteful.
Hmm.
So I think, to answer your question, put your information forward, be transparent, don't play games. And then on the things that really matter, put your focus or your energy into those issues. So for instance, liquidity is always a problem when we're talking about businesses and divorce.
Sure.
Because like I said, one person's going to keep the business and the other one's going to get a cash payment. Well, where is that cash payment coming from?
Hmm.
It may be attributable to the value of the business, but very few businesses are going to have, a big pile of unneeded cash laying around to effectively partially liquidate themselves. So that's where I would focus the effort, the attention, the strategy is to protect the ongoing business from a liquidity crunch that could compromise the business.
Sure.
So how do you do that, right?
Yep. Yep. No, I mean that's fantastic advice. So just again, out of curiosity, as you're talking, I have a lot of questions. I'm going to limit how many I ask you, but the one thing that comes to mind is you as an attorney. Have you ever been? I assume you have been on the side of someone that's really unreasonable, right? Meaning your client turns out to be unreasonable, and so where you've had to walk away from it, or sort of not be able to deal with it in a way that you normally would.
So this is what I'd say about that. I'm very much a straight shooter.
Yep.
I do not just tell clients what they want to hear.
Yep.
I don't think that's what they're paying me for, or that I
Sure.
serve them well by doing that.
Yeah.
Any potential new client is going to experience that the first time they meet with me.
Uh-huh.
So I think some potential clients actually like weed themselves out because they just don't like my style, and
Sure.
that's fine.
Yep.
I have a very, very collaborative relationship with clients. So if I think a client's being unreasonable, I'm going to tell them, and I'm going to tell them why, and I'm going to tell them what I think the consequences are of the road they want to go down. And I'm
Sure.
also going to listen, because maybe there's something there that I'm not understanding. Maybe I'm perceiving something as unreasonable because I don't really have the whole picture, or there's some element of it that I'm not appreciating. So that's a time for real conversation, 2 directions, and not just a sort of off the cuff, you're crazy. I might think that. But I still try to listen. Ultimately, if a client is insisting on a strategy that I think is detrimental to them, we might part ways.
Sure.
Sometimes sometimes a client will be like really convinced that my advice is not right.
Right.
That often comes up in the context of, well, my friend said, or my cousin said, or my mother doesn't understand why I'm not getting the house.
Right.
Um, Sometimes I talk to the person's mother, because sometimes they really need that support of like, let me just explain it to her directly because she's trying to help and support you, and she's so on your side that she's making this worse for you by
Sure.
constantly telling you that what's happening can't be right. Um, Sometimes I recommend a second opinion. I mean, I have no ego in it in terms of if a client really thinks that my advice is wrong, maybe we come to the point where I say, go talk to somebody else if you think I'm off base. That's fine. There's an element of judgment involved in this work. And then if they come back and they say, Sally Lawyer Esquire told me that she can get me XYZ, I'm like, go for it.
Yep.
I
Yep.
mean, I may be very skeptical that Sally Lawyer Esquire can do that. Um, every now and then that situation will come up, and then the client will come back and be like, never mind.
Yeah. Yep. Yep.
So, I think people need to be smart consumers. Clients should be skeptical of lawyers who promise them the moon and the stars because
Yep.
everything in this situation is going to be a compromise.
Sure. Sure.
Compromise is the name of the game.
Yep, I think that's just sound advice. So I guess one of the things that always comes up, right? Like when you receive a call or will receive a call on something, like let's say someone calls us about an investigation, right? Can you help with surveillance? Can you help with research? Can you whatever it is? They've already taken like 18 steps, and now they want to talk about and whatever it is. And so what if someone's contemplating divorce this is as it relates to business, right? And they or are in the process, right? And they own a business together separately, whatever the case is. What are some things that you would say for those people to do and perhaps maybe not do, if that makes sense?
So the overarching rule is to maintain the status quo. Don't
Mm.
change anything. Because if you start making changes and then the divorce comes, you may be held accountable for any negative impact. It's the same principle that if, the divorce is coming and I give all my jewelry away, quote unquote, to my sister, I'm still going to be charged with that jewelry.
Right.
So I think it can be very dangerous to think, well, I'm going to reorganize things a little bit so it will be better for me in the divorce, because the divorce process is going to look back, usually 5 years.
Hmm.
And then if unilateral changes were made, you may end up holding the bag towards, maybe what you would have paid if you hadn't made those changes.
Sure. Sure. I,
You know,
I, I think again that's sound advice. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
oh, I was just going to say, I also think people really need to think about what their priorities are coming out. Do you
Mhm.
want to keep this business? Um, I mean, particularly if people are working together in the business, probably tensions and disagreements around the business are part of the reason for the divorce, right? Is someone staying and someone going? Does it make sense to sell it? I mean, the saddest thing that I see is where the business suffers because the relationship is suffering.
Sure.
And then, there's a loss of the value to both parties in the divorce. So, if it really doesn't seem practical to continue the business in a divorce situation, maybe you should be having a conversation sooner than later about marketing that business while it's thriving.
Sure.
Cash out of it, share the proceeds. So it's that forward looking thought about what's the next chapter going to look like? What do I want out of this? But I think taking unilateral actions is very risky.
Sure. No, I think that makes a ton of sense. And you actually shared that 1 in 20 business owners close their doors after divorce, right? So, and it may be partially because of what you're talking about. Why do you think that is, and how do you prevent that from happening?
So I actually don't know the source of that statistic. So I'm just going to take it as a general. Sometimes the business fails after divorce.
Okay.
There could be lots of reasons. If both people were working in the business, have you not effectively replaced the services of the spouse who left? Is there too much liquidity pressure? Meaning, I was ordered to pay my spouse $500,000 and I took too much of my working capital out of the business in order to do it. That needs to be thoughtfully considered in a divorce of not putting so much cash pressure on the business that it might fail,
Sure.
which could just, payments over time. Maybe they're fixed, maybe they're contingent on the business's performance if you can convince your ex-spouse to do it that way. I think people go through a lot of changes in a divorce. They may have changes in their home situation, including with their kids. So I know there are situations where people cannot put the same hours into the business that they may have when they were in a joint household. Some parents have, a real realization that they want to be home more. And those days that their kids are with them, they want to be there. So it may also be a change of priorities.
I mean, that makes sense. Just one follow-up question I had related to, like, again, you talked about making unilateral changes or angling or making, like almost prepping for divorce, right? Just out of curiosity, and this is not this is more of your opinion, obviously, is how do courts sympathize with um, either party if they sense the other is operating in a sort of uh, you know I guess not operating in good faith.
That is a great question, Forhad, and I'm glad you raised it.
Hmm.
So our courts in New York sit in equity, meaning they have a great deal of discretion to do what they think is fair. And they will absolutely consider divorce planning, bad faith, actions taken that damage the value of assets. Those things are written into the law as considerations the court is affirmatively invited to make. And that's on, that's sort of the top level. There's also the level of advocacy. And, we all want to walk into the courtroom with our client looking like the good guy, the cooperative one, the person who's willing to compromise.
Sure.
And that means prioritizing because you're not going to compromise about everything, right? You have to decide these two things are super important to me and I want to stand really strong on them, but I'm willing to compromise in some other areas so I'm not just belligerent. Because nobody's going to get 100% of what they want. And if you don't point to the areas you're willing to compromise, they may be imposed on you and not where you wanted them. So the conduct leading to the divorce, the conduct during the divorce is extremely important, particularly if you're before a judge, because the judge in equitable distribution, which is how we distribute assets, in spousal support, even in child support, and who keeps the house and who doesn't keep the house and who keeps the business and who gets bought out, the court has the decision. The court has the discretion.
Well, that's again, I'm glad I asked that question too. I'm sure that's on the mind of people. I mean, for good and bad reasons. So that's really helpful. And this is a tough question. So, is there anything about the law you think um, low hanging fruit? I'm talking about that could use some changing.
Oh, don't get me started. Um, the law constantly needs to be changing because society is changing. So, the places where I think we're playing catch up in New York right now, it's not so pertinent to businesses, but you have more and more families where both parents are working outside the home, parents are sharing custody equally, and the child support law in New York is very clunky in terms of really being equitable between two households that have kind of the same amount of time with the kids and kind of the same expenses.
Sure.
I see the judges trying to use the discretion the law gives them to recognize that to the extent the law allows it. But many states have already amended their custody laws and their child support laws to better reflect where society is at the moment. New York always seems to run kind of, farther back in the pack and making those kinds of legislative amendments. We were very late to get no-fault divorce in New York. But a note on that might be interesting for the show.
Sure.
Given your work. We do have no-fault divorce in New York. We've had no-fault divorce since 2015. So some of the things that people think about when they think about investigators and divorce are just not relevant
Sure.
anymore.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I told my 15-year-old daughter this morning that I was doing the podcast today and told her a little bit about you and your firm. And she was like, "You work with investigators? That's so cool." Because she imagined, like the long lens cameras, like hiding in a tree, taking pictures through the bedroom window. A lot of what we need investigated at this point would be financial.
Sure.
Anyway, to the question of what could be changed, I think the law leaves a lot of room for shaping an outcome to each situation, and I do think that works well.
Sure.
And then, there are trends that emerge at different times. When I came into the field, it was commonplace to see, for instance, the value of a law firm partnership awarded 50% of that value to the other spouse, which could be a lot of money. Over time, the courts have pulled that trend down. So now we're seeing awards, like a high award might be more like 25% now, maybe 30%. And you are seeing some lower awards where courts are more cognizant of, well, maybe the other spouse also had their own career. Maybe this wasn't a family where, everybody's efforts were focused on one person's earning ability. Maybe it's just a coincidence that one party's earnings are embedded in a quote unquote business structure while the other one is an employee. What is the difference really in some families? So the law leaves room to take consideration of how families might be changing or more different kinds of families are presenting themselves to the courts.
Sure. No, that's great. And I guess going back to anecdote stories, right? Is there something that you can share that demonstrates either or a good or bad situation related to a business owned by a married couple?
Well, I'll tell you an unfortunate one, and we'll see if we have time for a nicer story.
Sure.
This was years ago. The family had a restaurant. It was a neighborhood restaurant. They both worked there and worked hard. She would get up very early in the morning, unlock, go in, and begin cooking. There were breads and other things that had to be started early in the day, sauces to be ready for the day.
Sure.
So she had an early day. She'd wrap up mid-morning. In the meantime, her husband ran the front of the restaurant. He'd come in, actually open for customers and run the staff. So she came to me very distressed. Her husband had formed what seemed to be like an overly close friendship with someone who worked in the restaurant. Well, this goes again to your field. Hello, people. There are cameras everywhere.
Yeah.
So she finally realizes that their security system has a camera in basically every space, and she discovers this is an affair.
Sure.
She's extremely distressed. For reasons I can't understand, he keeps denying it. Cameras, people.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the business, they just couldn't figure out a way to do the business
Yeah.
with taking one or the other out of the equation. So they ended up selling it, which, that's not such a bad thing. It was this solid neighborhood going concern. It had value. But where did it leave the two of them in terms of ongoing earnings?
Sure.
Right? This was their livelihood. So I would say there is an expression, I guess I won't say on the podcast, about don't do a particular something where you eat.
Yeah.
Um, so, their business was really disrupted by the personal element, right? What happened in their relationship.
Yeah.
But not so disrupted that the business was ruined before it could be sold. So I guess that in its own way is a silver lining.
Sure. Sure.
The cases that I really enjoy are the ones where we can have smart, strategic sort of structures in place so that everybody gets their fair outcome, but we protect the business.
Sure.
Sure. So, I thought of a situation where my client was a real estate broker to the stars, and also had a portfolio of rental real estate owned by the business. And this was really complicated because how do you give the other spouse their percentage of value?
Right.
And we ended with an agreement to liquidate a portion of the rental portfolio, to do it slowly and strategically, to make good on the market when the market's right. This requires some trust.
Sure.
Right? This is why you don't want trust destroyed, because for my client's spouse to allow her the discretion of timing and price was important, and obviously could have been manipulated. And then we structured some payments that were contingent on the timing of those liquidations, so that the business would never have to pull out its operating capital in order to fund the divorce settlement. And my client could leave. Does my client want to shrink her rental real estate portfolio? Not really. But if that was the avenue to keep the business 100% secure while doing what we needed to do in the settlement to be fair to her spouse, I consider that to be a fantastic outcome.
Yeah, that definitely is. And it sounds like you were dealing with some very reasonable people. So that's fantastic. So again, we've talked about a lot. And so if you were to leave our audience with one or two things in general advice for anyone dealing with family situations, which may eventually land them in a legal proceeding, what would that be?
I could go on at length, but I'll try not to. One is, get a therapist if you don't have one. Find a place to process the emotional part of what's going on so that you can be clear-headed and focused when you're talking about the financial element. Once we start mixing emotion in with money, it doesn't make people make better decisions.
Sure.
I think people have to think about what, if they're thinking about, oh, I want to win, be careful about that. What does winning mean in this context? And I would try to move away from that to, what do I want the next chapter of my life to look like? And what should I prioritize now to make that happen for myself? That helps a lot of things fall into place when decisions have to be made. Some people come in the door thinking, I absolutely have to have the country house. So many happy memories there. I love going there. But when you take out your pointy pencil and you look at the economics, you realize, as, not as a married couple, but as a separate person, how constraining that might be. Maybe it's not worth it. Maybe that's not part of the next chapter. Maybe you cherish those happy memories, but you move on. Or maybe the country house is so important that you're willing to downsize in the city, and that's the better formula. But things are going to change. And I try to help people understand that even some things you like that work really well for you are going to change. I think people get into hot water when they rush into divorce thinking that everything will be the same, except I'm going to take my tweezers and like pull out my spouse and toss them aside. That's not what's going to happen. Everything's going to change. And some of it you're going to like, and some of it you're not going to like. So if you can try to be forward looking to shape the outcome into what you think you want for your next chapter, that's your best way to make the right decisions, so things are going to fall out in a way that you feel really good about, and you can enjoy and you can thrive in what's coming.
No, I think that's just fantastic advice. And it's interesting. A lot of the broad sort of like advice that you're giving. We actually on the last podcast we talked to a partner of ours who helps us with security situations in Africa, and much of what he was talking about was planning. Make it, like all of these things that you're talking about can be applicable like across the board in decision making in general. So I really am glad we got this episode off the ground, and I'm really glad that you were on talking about this specific topic, because again, it's obvious why your clients come to you, and it's obvious that you take the approach of finding real solutions as opposed to real billing, right? And so I think that's such a critical element when you're in such a sensitive situation and you're looking at someone as for answers, right? Not more problems. So thank you so much for being on, and for everyone listening out there, we'll put Margaret's contact information and law firm information in the description of the podcast. So feel free to reach out to her directly with any questions, or reach out to us and we'll get you connected. So thank you so much, Margaret.
Terrific talking to you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Till next time.
Take care.
Don't forget to follow us. We are on LinkedIn and Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube.